Operations carried on at Giza. Before I describe the operations carried on at the pyramids in the spring and summer of 1837, it is necessary to state the condition in which I found them on my first arrival in Egypt, and some other particulars, which may tend to make the operations in question better understood. I arrived in Alexandria on the 29th of December, 1835, with the intention of visiting Upper and Lower Egypt, but finding that an opportunity would present itself, towards the end of February, of visiting Syria with peculiar advantage, I determined to postpone till my return from that country my voyage into Upper Egypt, and to spend the time that remained at my disposal in Cairo. Among the many objects of interest, which the neighborhood of that curious and picturesque city afforded, the pyramids, particularly those of Giza, attracted my attention from the grandeur and simple majesty of their forms, from the remote antiquity and uncertainty of their origin, and also from the peculiarity of their mysterious construction, since, after the investigation of many ages, doubts were still entertained, not only as to the purpose for which the passages and chambers already discovered were originally intended, but in a much greater degree respecting any other passages or apartments, which might reasonably be supposed to exist in these enormous structures. An additional interest arose from the great probability that they were the mighty works of the shepherd kings, whose descendants, according to Manetho, after their expulsion from Egypt, under the denomination of Philistines built in Syria Jerusalem, and also many defensive towns, which had the same names as those they had quitted in Egypt. This extraordinary people appear to have been of the same race with the Cyclopes and heroic adventurers, whose enormous structures and architectural skill, and whose wanderings and misfortunes, have been celebrated by the ancient poets. As it had been suggested, that the inclined passages were intended for astronomical observations, I endeavored to ascertain whether the angles of inclination were the same in the great and second pyramids of Giza and in that of Dahza. I was anxious, likewise, to examine more particularly the channels proceeding from the king's chamber in the Great Pyramid, which appeared likely to conduct to other apartments. For this purpose I revisited the pyramids of Giza on the 13th February, 1836. And took with me Mr. Hill, a very intelligent person, who now keeps the hotel at Cairo, but who was then employed in the packers' service, as superintendent of some copper mills worked by steam in the citadel. The following is an account of the condition in which we then found the pyramids, and, I may add, in which they remained when operations were commenced upon them in the following of November. State of the Great Pyramid at Giza. The inclined passage from the entrance to the subterraneous apartment, that apartment itself, and the unfinished passage proceeding to the southward from it, were open, although much encumbered with stones and rubbish, as were the forced and upper passages leading to the king's and queen's chambers. These two chambers, together with Davison's, and the communication, or well, descending from the great upper passage to that of the subterraneous apartment, were also open. In the floor of the subterraneous apartment, an excavation had been made to the depth of a few feet. Some stones had also been removed from behind the wall at the southeastern corner of Davison's chamber. One of the blocks composing the pavement had been taken up near the northwestern corner of the king's chamber, and an excavation had been carried on beneath the sarcophagus. This last, however, was almost entirely filled up with rubbish. The mouth of the southern air channel had been partially enlarged, and an excavation of a few feet had been made near the portcullis, along the course of the northern air channel. In the Queen's chamber a considerable passage had been forced into the solid masonry, from the niche on the eastern side. There was also a large hollow near the granite blocks at the commencement of the ascending passage, which was supposed to have been the forced entrance made by the caliphs. These were the only excavations of any consequence. On the exterior of the pyramid a vast heap of stones and rubbish, 50 feet in height, extended from the base to the entrance of the inclined passage. Horizontal passage to the forced portcullis, and a considerable part of the reascending passage leading to the lower entrance. The inclined passage from the horizontal part of this communication, together with the small chamber to which it conducted, were likewise accessible. Several stones had been removed from the pavement near the sarcophagus in Belzoni's chamber, and a large excavation had been carried on across the upper horizontal passage to a considerable extent. A mound, similar to that on the exterior of the Great Pyramid, extended from the base to the upper entrance. The chasm in the center of the northern front, by which the caliphs are supposed to have entered, and in which Belzoni commenced his operations, was apparent, and there is no doubt that, before the stones had collapsed, it communicated with the excavation, already mentioned, across the horizontal passage. State of the third pyramid, and of the others. In the northern front of the third pyramid a considerable chasm had been made, said, by Denon, to have been the work of the Mamelukes, while below it another smaller chasm had been carried on upon the level of the upper line of granite, which forms the front of the lower part of the pyramid. A great deal of rubbish, and many large blocks of calcareous stone and of granite, were lying around it, particularly on the northern side, in which the above-mentioned excavations had been made. Some of these had been taken away at the center, but the difficulty of removing the heavy masses without the assistance of machinery, had put a stop to the operation. Opposite the center, and at some little distance from the base of the pyramid, a pit about 20 or 30 feet square had been excavated in the rubbish, the sides of which had been supported by a revetment of large stones. Several blocks had been forced from a pavement at the bottom of this pit, it would seem, in search of an entrance into the pyramid, and many others yet remained there, similar to those afterwards uncovered to the eastward, but there was no appearance that the pyramid had ever been opened. The three smaller pyramids south of the third, and the three east of the Great Pyramid, were more or less dilapidated, but were closed up. We took the angles of the entrance of the Great, and of the second, pyramids, but, having no other instruments than a fine edge and level, and the surface of the stone being rough and uneven, notwithstanding the exquisite regularity and perfection of the masonry, our mensurations, probably, were wrong, as we afterwards found that they did not accord with those taken subsequently with a theodolite, by Mr. Perring. We carefully examined Davison's chamber in the Great Pyramid, and the result of this examination was a conjecture, that it formed a sort of entresol between the king's chamber and some large sepulchral apartment over it, to which the inclined ceiling of the great passage was, probably, an entrance. I also thought that the channels proceeding from the king's chamber communicated with other apartments. In the second pyramid it was evident that the rescending passage, returning to the north, led to a lower entrance. The following remarks on the pyramids of Saqqara and Daza, and on those of Hawara and Al-Diyarus may not, possibly, be altogether devoid of interest, although not immediately connected with the subject in question. I did not examine the two latter pyramids till my second visit to Egypt. In the entrance of number 15 there were two large medians executed in white stucco, that have precisely the appearance of ivory, and may have been intended to represent that substance, in which, and in gold Phidias, and Praxiteles are said to have chiefly carved, and as the Hebrews, as well as the Greeks, may be imagined to have carried arts, and sciences with them from this wonderful country. These sculptures may serve to explain, not only the works of the above-mentioned artists, but also the ivory palaces mentioned in Scripture. Processions of prisoners, or of victims, are frequently represented, with their arms fastened behind them, and with a rope round their necks, possibly to denote, in the Grecian manner, slavery, or helotism. Some of these appear to be Jews, others have scarfs over their shoulders, and their hair, which is extremely bushy, cut square before, and behind, with a perpendicular bald stripe behind their ears, and a large dress hanging down each side of their faces. Negroes, and different nations, are also portrayed, some of whom are dressed in flowered garments. In other places are figures without their heads, which are separately represented with a sacrificial knife, also decapitated persons in a kneeling position, with their arms tied behind them to a stake surmounted by a jackal's head. In one instance I observed a row of kneeling figures, each of whom was held down by a priestess, whilst the blood spouted out, like a fountain, from the top of his head into a cup or basin placed before him. One of these victims appeared to be struggling with two priestesses, and endeavoring to escape. There is, therefore, little doubt that human sacrifices are represented by these designs, and that they formed part of the sepulchral rites of persons of consequence. A conclusion to which Mr. Hamilton also appears to have arrived. The several divinities, it may be added, are represented in the usual forms, but generally with more decorous emblems than in the temples and other buildings. A child in the character of Harpocrates seated on a winged globe is supposed by Mr. Wilkinson to typify regeneration after death, and another figure seems to be rising out of a tomb at the command of a divinity. I shall not, however, attempt even a general description of these interesting paintings, as it would not only require considerable detail, but much more observation than I had time to bestow upon them. The Sphinx, an account of view. Cavier's excavations Ikoate taken from the papers of the late Mr. Salt. An account of view. Cavier's excavations taken from the papers of the late Mr. Salt. This monument, so imposing in its aspect, even in the multi-altered state, to which it has been reduced, has always excited the admiration of those who possessed sufficient knowledge of art to appreciate its merits at a first glance, for, though to an untutored eye there remains so little of the features as scarcely to give more than a general idea of the human head, yet, by repeated and accurate observation, the several parts may be sufficiently traced to afford a tolerably complete idea of its original perfection. The contemplative turn of the eye, the mild expression of the mouth and the beautiful disposition of the drapery at the angle of the forehead, sufficiently attest the admirable skill of the artist, by whom it was executed. It is true, that no great attention has been paid to those proportions, which we are accustomed to admire, nor does the pleasing impression, which it produces, result from any known rule adopted in its execution, but it may rather be attributed to the unstudied simplicity of the conception, to the breadth, yet high finish, of the several parts, and to the stupendous magnitude of the whole. Such are the sentiments which a repeated view of this extraordinary work has inspired. At first, I confess, that, like many other travellers, I felt that the praises lavished upon it by Norden, Denon, and by others, were exaggerated, but, the more I studied it at different hours of the day, and under different effects of light, and of shade, the more I became convinced of their having barely done justice to its merits. It must indeed be allowed, that the drawings by both these gentlemen but faintly accord with their encomiums, but, after having repeated the same task myself with little success, I must admit, that the difficulties, which attend the undertaking, are sufficient to baffle the efforts of anyone not professionally dedicated to the arts. Before I proceed, I must premise, that the general impression, made upon me by this monument, has been produced by a deliberate contemplation of it, when laid open to its space, with the fragments of a beard resting beneath the chin, with its paws stretched 50 feet in advance, and with the temple, the granite tablet, find the altar, represented in the accompanying sketchiest, spread out on a regular platform in its front. These interesting objects, which no one for ages had had an opportunity of seeing, have undoubtedly tended to exalt it in my estimation, and, in order that I may endeavour to convey something of the same feeling to others, I shall proceed to a detailed account of what I've discovered by Captain Caviglia, which, together with the several sketches taken on the spot during the progress of his operations, may remain as a record of his labours, when the objects themselves are destroyed, or again entombed in the moving sands. From various reports in circulation in Egypt, I was given to understand that the French engineers had made a considerable excavation in front of the Sphinx, and that they had just discovered a door at the time when they were compelled to suspend their operations. This account was confirmed by the repeated assertions of the Arabs, several of whom declared that they had been present at the discovery and said that the door led into the body of the Sphinx, while others affirmed that it conducted up to the second pyramid. Though little stress could be laid upon such statements, yet they rendered Captain Caviglia very unwilling to give up his researches without at least doing all in his power to ascertain the fact. To this end he first began to open a deep trench on the left, or northern, side, opposite the shoulder of the statue, and, though the sand was so loose that the wind drove back frequently during the night more than half of what had been removed in the day, yet he managed, by the aid of planks arranged so as to support the sides, to dig down in a few days to the base. As the trench, however, was not more than 20 feet across at the top, and not above 3 feet wide at the bottom, the situation of the workmen evidently became dangerous, for, if any large body of sand had fallen in, and the planks were very weak, it must have irrecoverably smothered those who were employed below. It was therefore found necessary to abandon this part of the attempt. By what had been done, however, the height of the statue from the top of the head to the base was ascertained, and it was also found that the external surface of the body was composed of stones, of various sizes but put together. Found in the small temple Togiata with 2 other tablets, composed of calcareous stone. One of these was in its original position, the other had fallen down, and was afterwards sent to the British Museum. See plate, view of temple. Between the front walls of this temple a small lion of good workmanship was found, with the head towards the image. See view of temple, and, as small statues of the Bulmads are similarly placed in Indian temples, I conceived that this statue was in its original position. Fragments of other lions, ruddy carved, and the head and shoulders of a sphinx, were likewise discovered. All these remains, together with the tablets, and platform of the tumble, had been ornamented with red paint, which color, according to Pausanias, was appropriated in Egypt, as in India, to sacred purposes. A large part of the left paw was uncovered, and the platform of masonry was found to extend beyond it, and, in the course of a fortnight, Captain Caviglia had removed the sand from the paw, and from the outer walls of the temple, in front of which was an altar formed of granite. It is now in the British Museum, and has had at the angles projecting stones, which may be supposed to have been called the horns of the altar. The altar yet retains the marks of fire and the effects, probably, of burnt offerings. The opening between the 2 walls was raised 2 feet above the pavement, and formed a sort of window, which, it may be supposed, that the priests only were admitted into the temple, and near it another lion, rudely carved, and apparently intended to have been placed upon one of the walls, was dug up. It is now in the British Museum. The figure of an owl and 3 small cones, which had belonged to an altar, were also discovered. Seems to have been a votive offering. The interior wall had probably been surmounted with small sphinxes, like that already described. They prove that the image that held in high veneration conformed the expression of Pliny, I sense quasi Sylvester Nemus Calentium, and contain various phrases, which elucidate many doubtful points in the sculptures in the adjacent tombs. Captain Caviglia succeeded in laying open the base of the Sphinx, and in clearing away the sand in front of it, to the extent of more than 100 feet. I sense it is scarcely possible, continues Mr. Salt, for any person, unused to operations of this kind, to form no idea of the difficulties, which Captain Caviglia had to surmount, when working at the depth of the base. In spite of all his precautions, the slightest breath of wind, or concussion set the surrounding particles of TBC sand in motion, so that the sloping sides crumbled away, and mass after mass tumbled in, till the whole moving surface bore no unapt resemblance to a cascade of water. Even when the sides appeared most firm, if the laborers suspended their work only for an hour, they found that the greater part of their labor had to be renewed. This was particularly the case on the southern side of the right paw, where the people were employed for 7 days without making any sensible advance, because the sand rolled down in one continued and regular torrent as it was removed. He therefore only examined the end of the paw, where an imperfect inscription was discovered on the second digit, and a few dedicatory phrases, addressed to Harpocrates, to Mars, and to Hermes, at the distance of about 2 feet to the southward of the right paw. The platform abruptly terminated. It was therefore supposed that the Sphinx was placed upon a pedestal, but, by extending the operations in front of the statue, the platform was found to he continued, and the steps, too, were discovered. They were bounded on each side. The walls formed of unburnt brick, like those which enclosed the ancient cities and temples of Egypt. The inner sides of the walls, nearest the steps, were lined with stone, and were coated with plaster. The stonework, however, appeared comparatively modern, for upon several of the blocks were the remains of Greek inscriptions, which alluded to other buildings, and another of the inscriptions recorded repairs, which were performed by the orders of Antoninus, and of Vyse. The walls appeared to branch off towards the north, and also towards the south, and to form a large enclosure around the Sphinx, but their direction was not ascertained. The steps, about 10 foot in breadth, and 8 inches in height, were 30 in number. They ended abruptly on the northern side, so as to leave a passage between them and the wall. CNN in ground plan, this passage was not examined. On a stone platform, at the top of the steps, was a small building which, from its construction, and from various inscriptions found near it, seemed to have been a station whence the emperors, and other persons of distinction, who visited the pyramids, could witness the religious ceremonies performed at the altar below. An inscription on the front of it was much worn. Another inscription on a stele was found in ground plan. It was erected in the time of the Emperor Nero, and bestows on him the epithet which is also found on his coins, with the figure of a crowned serpent, the true symbol of that title. Dr. Young has indeed stated that Greek symbol was often represented in Egyptian mythology by a winged globe, but wings were the emblems of the, and a globe of fur, and together with the crowned snake, they formed the symbol of the great god. Mr. Birch's note on the large tablet. This tablet represents a prosema, or act of adoration, offered to the Sphinx by Thothmes IV. Or V, supposed to have reigned 1446 BC. The upper part is divided by a perpendicular line of hieroglyphics, which expresses the following declaration of the Sphinx: "We decree, that the sun, the establisher of the world, Rementor, shall be crowned on the throne of Seb, that Thothmes, the crown of crowns, shall be adorned with the glory of Atum, pedestal, which resembles a doorway, and the image on the left receives a libation offered by the monarchy and is accompanied with an inscription expressing the sun, in his solar mountain, or the lord of the two solar abodes, and with the following declaration: we grant life and power to Thothmes, the lord of the world, the crown of crowns." In the other compartment, the same monarch pours a libation on an altar, and offers burning incense to the Sphinx, which it here styled Ra or Hor in the solar mountain, and he said to grant power and victory to the Lord of the world, to Thothmes, the crown of crowns. The remaining 13 lines can scarcely be made out, but they begins as follows: "In the first year, on the 19th day of Athyr, under the purify of Horus, the mighty bull, the establisher of diadems, the lord of the upper and lower hemispheres, established with dominion, like at a golden hawk, the director of the years, the conqueror of the Libyans, the king, the sun, the preserver of worlds, the son of the sun, Thothmes, the diadem of diadems, the giver of life, of stability, and of power, like the sun forever." Any attempt to explain the rest of the inscription would require restoration of the text, which would be attended with great uncertainty, but it appears to record to act of adoration performed by the monarch to the Sphinx to enumerate the benefits supposed to have been conferred by the idol, and also the following address of the Sphinx to the king: "Am thy father the god in the solar mountain Tor, and Atum." The inscription also declares that the king shall wear the two crowns, which compose the royal schent, and that he shall sit on the throne of Seb, the youngest of the gods. In the 13th line, part of a Kartach occurs, which is apparently the praenomen of the king Ra-Shuef or Shafa, supposed to be Chephren, but the fracture in the inscription makes it impossible to determine in what manner the name is mentioned. It is, however, to be remarked, that the Sphinx is situated before the eastern front of the ruins, supposed to have been a temple connected with the second pyramid, which is said to have been built by Chephren, and also, that it is proved by this tablet, which seems to have been executed in the first year of the reign of Thothmes IV, that the construction of the image had then been achieved, which, from its enormous size, could scarcely have been effected in 1 year. In this tablet the Sphinx is identified with the sun under the appellation of Horus, or the god of the solar abode. In the royal Cartouches a Sphinx signifies a lord or master, and it is called in hieroglyphics Okra. The Greeks imagined that it represented intellect, or strength, but they seem to bear alluded to the Sphinx of Thebes in Boeotia, and not to those in Egypt, which usually personified distinguished monarchs, as has been proved by 2 inscriptions, connected with Amenoph III, or Memnon, which have been already published. The figure of a lion appears to have been connected with the sun. Became his name Mui, splendor, wisdom, intellect, and one of these animals, indeed, appears to have accompanied distinguished Egyptian kings in their conquests, who, from their heroic exploits, were often mentioned, as a lion among inferior animals. Amulets and scarabaei have been often inscribed with the names of Egyptian kings, who are in the form of a sphinx, and in the act of treading underfoot Asiatic, or Negro prisoners. The sphinx, at Giza, therefore probably represented, under the character of the sun, the monarch by whose orders the image was constructed, and it was afterwards worshipped in consequence of the superstitious observances, which gave rise to the deification of departed kings, to whose service priests of different orders were dedicated, and whose glory was compared to the noonday effulgence of the Sunday. Note by Mr. Birch on the smaller tablet between the 4 legs of the Sphinx. Ramesses the Great, Sesostris, supposed to have reigned 1355 BC, dressed in his robes, holds in his hand an emshoya, or censer, and a conical piece of bread, which he offers to a sphinx placed on a pedestal, which, like that in the tablet plate B, the form of a doorway. The sphinx has the body of a lion, the headdress of a god, or of a monarch, and the features in Mr. Salt's drawing resemble those of Ramesses. Before the sphinx is an altar adorned with flowers, and behind the king is a royal standard, supported by a human head, and by 4 arms, 2 of which elevate the standard, and the others bold a kukan for scepter, and the feather of truth below the standard are the emblem of heaven, and the staff, which ends in a signet representing the orbit of the sun. Above the head of the king is Har of Hat, the Horus of Edfu, the celestial sun encircled by Uri, which sustain the symbols of life, and the crowns of the upper and lower hemispheres, over which the sun presided. The inscriptions on the upper part contain the names and the titles of the monarch in question, and also those of the Sphinx. The monarch is styled the gracious god, directed the lord of upper and the lower world, the sun the director of truth, approved of the sun the lord of diadems, Ramesses, beloved of Amun, the giver of life, like the sun forever, Ha-Hat, the giver of life, of stability, and of power, a gift of incense and of libations, Hara of the 2 solar abodes, which refer to the Sphinx in the character of Har, or of Horus, the sun, of life, of stability, and of power, with the following epithets: the giver of victory, and of magnanimity, like the sun continually. The inscriptions on the sides of the tablet are nearly alike, but that on the right is most perfect. They express Ha, the sun, the ruler of the upper and of the lower world; Aroeris, the victorious bull, the beloved of truth, the lord of the upper and of the lower worlds, the regulator of Egypt, the chastiser of nations, the hawk of gold.